What strange events have gotten swept under the rug? Story 1. The financial panic of 2008 was triggered by a $550 billion drawdown of money market accounts in the USA about 11 a.m. on Thursday, September 15th, 2008. It was an electronic run on the banks. Had they not closed down the money market accounts immediately, the Treasury estimated that by 2 p.m. that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been withdrawn, and the entire economy of the United States would have collapsed, and within 24 hours, the world economy would have collapsed. Who did the initial $550 billion drawdown? This info was put in the memory hole, and the press does not discuss it. The Wikipedia article Global Financial Crisis in September 2008 has only the following sentence. By the morning of September 18th, money market sell orders from institutional investors totaled $0.5 trillion out of a total market capitalization of $4 trillion. But a $105 billion liquidity injection from the Federal Reserve averted an immediate collapse. Story 2. Metcalf sniper attack. On a random day in 2013, somebody in California decided to go underground and cut phone line. 30 minutes later, professional snipers sprayed the Metcalf power substation for 20 minutes. They severely damaged all transformers and cost the company $15 million. Literally a minute before the police arrived, the snipers began fleeing. How did they get in? Why were they so emboldened to shoot for 20 darn minutes? What were their motivations? And why run away right before the police car arrived? To this day, no one knows who these guys are. No fingerprints were found. We tend to take things like infrastructure for granted. And it's events like this that make me feel queasy because the perpetrators got off scot-free and probably paved the path for future copycats around the country. Story 3. The Phoenix Lights. My whole immediate family and tons of people on the street we lived on saw the aircraft come overhead. We all stood there speechless and terrified until it passed. Then the whole block freaked out. Nobody will ever convince me it was flares. We all saw the outline and structure of the craft clearly. It was so big and slow, it was amazing it was staying in the air. My hair still stands on end, even thinking about it right now. Story 4. Kind of random, but last summer it got to 50 degrees Celsius in Greater Vancouver, BC, highest recorded temperature in Canada ever. And the next day, the city of Lytton burned down. It was a phenomenon called a heat dome. It was really scary because no one ever thought it could get that hot here. And a ton of people died because only about 60% of places have AC. It was one of the scariest things I've ever been through. No one talks about it at all anymore. And that is terrifying to me, Edit. I have been reminded numerous times that Lytton is not greater than Vancouver. Temps in Greater Van were measured in the mid-40s, but with humidity it felt more like 50. I stand corrected. Extreme weather nonetheless, especially as many places like kitchens and warehouses do not have AC and temps in those places skyrocket. My townhouse in South Surrey measured in the upper 40s on the top floor. I also have had several people tell me that this is still discussed by people in their lives. I was just stating that I don't hear of it at all personally. Story 5. Not necessarily strange, but terrifying. Since the 80s, there has been a group of Christian anti-nuclear pacifists called the Plowshare Movement. They have broken into numerous nuclear arms facilities over the years to peacefully protest and have got into major trouble with many of them, receiving multiple prison sentences for their efforts, with no intent to stop. But the major takeaway from their activities is how shockingly easy it was for them to plan and gain access to these facilities. Sometimes it would be hours before they were discovered by military personnel after gaining access to sites. And it begs the question that if they're a peaceful protest group, what would happen if a terrorist organization were to attempt it? There's a book about it called Gods of Metal. Story 6. The entirety of George W. Bush administration has been whitewashed due to what a clown show Donald Trump was. At the end of his second term, he was legitimately being debated as one of the worst presidents in recent U.S. history. Today, he's largely thought of as a nice but dumb president that you could sit down and have a beer with. Some of the things he did. The 2000 election was decided by the courts in a state where his brother was governor. His terrible response to 9/11. His infamous Axis of Evil speech after the event. He specifically called out Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. North Korea was so unrelated to 9/11 that he could have done a better job if he just picked another country at random. Iran and Iraq hated each other and had been at each other's throats in the 80s. It made no sense to frame those three countries as the axis of evil as if they were allies. How the Iraq War was sold to America. The GOP initially tried to spread the narrative that Iraq and Saddam were linked to 9/11. Then, when that didn't hold up, They tried to say that they had so many weapons of mass destruction that they could be the source of the next 9/11. Finally, when they couldn't find WMDs, they retroactively tried to argue that, well, at least we got rid of Saddam. His response to Hurricane Katrina. There were still FEMA trailers housing people into the 2010 because of what a crap show that response was. Obama gets saddled with the reputation of being the bailout president, but Bush was actually the guy who initiated it in September of 2008, just as his term was ending. Another glossed over point here is that after the 2008 GFC, a whole bunch of formerly conservative economists came out and admitted that a lot of their theories were wrong. Milton Friedman, Arthur Laffer, an influential trickle-down guy, and Alan Greenspan. And today, conservatives still believe in their theories. Guess it helps that two of them are dead, though, and can't say, hey, I was wrong. Story 7. Anyone remember when the governor of NY Cuomo ordered that COVID patients be put into nursing homes with elderly people who he knew were the most vulnerable to the virus, which led to thousands of deaths? Also, there were hospitals and also a ship that offered to take these COVID patients to keep them away from others and vulnerable people, but he declined this offer? Anybody? I find it extremely weird that the reason that guy lost his job was because he touched some people inappropriately, and not because he murdered thousands of people. Story 8. This is a big one for me, although not too surprising. Gregory Douglas, a journalist who taped his interviews with former CIA operative Robert Crowley over a period of 4 years, recorded their telephonic conversations, and later published their transcripts in a book titled Conversations with the Crow. Crowley claimed that the CIA was responsible for eliminating Dr. Homi Bhabha, Indian nuclear scientist whose plane crashed into the Alps when he was going to attend a Vienna conference, and also eliminating Indian PM Lal Bahadur Shastri, who died at the Tashkent summit in 1966. Crowley said that a bomb in the cargo section of the plane went off in midair, bringing down the commercial Boeing 707 airliner in the Alps with little evidence left to be retrieved. Crowley claimed that the U.S. was wary of Indian nuclear progress and the defeat of their ally Pakistan in the 1965 war. The U.S. was worried that India could well dominate the Indian subcontinent, along with Russian think tanks, if India develops nuclear capabilities, thus bringing instability to the region, as seen. Story 9. The fact that brokers made it impossible to buy stocks in a couple of companies, GME, AMC, BBI, BB, ECT, that were insanely shorted fake shares created to bring the price of a company artificially down beyond their available shares and only allowing people to sell their shares. This insane collusion between market makers, brokers, and even the governing body of markets, or SEC, was quickly swept under the rug until people started buying in mass and holding said stocks of each company to push the hedge funds to insolvency. Story 10. We've had a spate of missing children from all over my state, 3 within a number of weeks. One was found days later drinking from a creek like nothing happened. Nothing more was said in the news, didn't hear anything. Another girl disappeared for a week, was murdered, and the killer, stepfather, was arrested. The mother was mentally unstable, admitted to hospital, and couldn't make a statement. Nothing more was said. I haven't heard anything since. Finally, the body of a baby was found in a freezer. The mother was arrested and cooperated with police and was eventually released without charges being pressed. Again, nothing more was said, no news, nothing. It's incredibly frustrating. It makes me feel like these children are going to be forgotten, especially the ones who were killed. We need to say their names, learn their story, and prevent it from happening again. Story 11. Sheriff Joe Arpaio of Maricopa County, that is Phoenix, was responsible for large amounts of fraud, massive amounts of human rights violations, accusations of harassment and blackmail of anyone that ran against him, and a large list of other crimes. Yet it was all constantly swept under the rug and never investigated. Eventually, something finally came up that the federal government decided to investigate. But before the investigation could happen, the sheriff's department raided the records building, and any relevant records disappeared, killing the investigation. Instead of becoming a national scandal, or, lots of arrests for illegally raiding a government building and destroying evidence, it never seemed to make it past local news, and was so effectively swept under the rug, it is almost impossible to find copies of the news stories anymore. Story 12. The USA is backing Saudi Arabia with weapons to go to war with the people of Yemen. Hundreds of thousands died as a result of the war, and about 25% are children. We essentially allowed them this war because we stepped on their toes by invading Iraq, because they saw Iraq as a buffer zone between them and Iran. U.S. government supplies them with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons every year. We do this because of the petrodollar, in which Saudi Arabia agrees to make all their oil sale in USD, which helps strengthen the dollar. Story 13. Sandra Bland. Say her name. She was a new professor at a college in Texas. She was from Chicago originally. While on a dry run to and from her school, a trooper raced up behind her, causing her to quickly change lanes to get out of his way. He initiated a traffic stop. During the interview process, he was aggressive with Bland, who wasn't having it. Eventually, he tells her to exit the vehicle, to which she refuses. A struggle ensues, and he forcibly removes her from the vehicle. She was later found hanging in her jail cell with a plastic industrial trash bag. There's no explanation as to how she got a hold of it. There's no explanation as to why she'd end herself. Sandra Bland has disappeared into a memory hole. The official cause of death is self-destruction. Story 14. Kanye West sang at the wedding of the grandson of the president of Kazakhstan. Yes, this is the same dictator who spent 30 years in power, stole over $200 billion, and in 2011 ordered the execution of peaceful protesters who dared to demand fair wages and a safe working environment for oil production. He renamed the capital in his honor streets, erected monuments to himself during his lifetime, and now he is angry when people demolish them. Pays Tony Blair, who lied with the U.S. about having chemical weapons in Iraq. He did not suffer any punishments and sanctions. Story 15. Currently, Iraq and Afghanistan are pretty much being swept under the rug by the U.S. pretty well. I'm not saying it's the exact same as the Ukraine situation. However, it is very similar. The U.S. didn't like the government in place, made up propaganda about how dangerous they were, invaded and started a war to replace the existing government and extract resources, harmed many civilians and lost young boys' lives along the way. Yet we act as if Russia is the devil right now, when really the U.S. has a bad reputation of doing the exact same thing. Story 16. The Yugoslav War. My mother was held in a concentration camp for 3 years in this war. It led to genocide and millions of deaths. Mass graves are still being discovered today. I'm sickened by the amount of people surprised by the invasion of Ukraine, saying it's the first war in Europe since World War II. This war happened in 1995. It was not long ago, is so little recognized, and nobody seems to care. It's just disgraceful how little knowledge people have about their own neighboring countries. Story 17. The Northeast Blackout of 2003. I remember news reports of the outage being caused by a virus entering into a power plant in Ohio's network through a vendor's network. It was in a number of security classes that I had taken at the time about making sure your vendors follow your organization's security policies and practices. Fast forward today, and it seems as though that part never happened, and it was attributed to something else instead. It's bizarre because I clearly remember the discussions in class circa 2003 through 2005 in my bachelor degree classes. I cannot even find the original news articles and case studies that were once part of the classes I had taken. Story 18. More of a historical point than a strange event, but Britain betraying Australia at the Arcadia Conference in World War II is 100% swept under the rug in both popular culture and in our education system. The quick story is that at the outbreak of World War II in Europe, Australia sent most of its professional army to Europe and North Africa in support of its allies. By 1941, Japan had entered the war, Singapore fell, and Australia had most of its professional military still deployed on the other side of the world. Australia pleaded with Britain if they could help their defense, at least to spare part of its naval force, which was massive. They not only refused, which is not wholly unreasonable, but then lied to Australia by promising that a British fleet would be sent if Australia was invaded. Historical records later confirming there was no such intention to ever do this. They also held secret talks with the U.S. to urge them to abandon Australia and the Pacific Theater in order to focus 100% on Germany. The plan specifically contemplated that Australia would likely be invaded, but that this was a sacrifice Britain would be willing to make and that they would try to help us in a few years once Germany was defeated. Thankfully, popular opinion in the U.S. was that Japan would not get away with Pearl Harbor, so they ignored this strategy, and the rest is history. I've never seen this betrayal discussed or reflected upon in the public forum, and our high school history books still paint Winston Churchill as a hero. In popular culture, many Australians still insist on preserving ties with the UK, and votes to separate Australia from the Crown to become an independent republic have failed. Story 19. The ride of GameStop stock in March last year. No news, no media reporting, no fundamental changes with the company, not a single thing. This is different from the January rate because the SEC gave an explanation, bullcrap, of the January events. Stocks don't double in price for no reason. Hedge funds had to buy back a lot of their negative bets on GME causing the March rise, but no one could admit that was the reason, and had no other scapegoat reason. So for the month or two during and after, it was crickets. Every other time when it rises or drops dramatically, they give a crap reason as to why. But that one time. Story 20. The annexation of Hawaii by the U.S. The American Christian missionaries go to Hawaii, give Bible to locals, take their lands, become rich sugar plantation owners, become influential. Then they want their own governance, wage war against Hawaii government while on their land, invite an American warship to the shores for assistance. D.C. sends it. Hawaii loses. America owns Hawaii. Later bill was passed making it a state. Next, another bill is passed to Americanize Hawaii. Via this bill, all Samoan culture is banned, its history is banned, language is banned. English has become the main language. In one generation, the kids coming out of the schools are true patriots, singing Star-Spangled Banner. Story 21. No mental disorder, not even schizophrenia, has ever been shown to be an actual pathology. No studies have shown any chemical imbalance, nor any deformation of the brains, except in cases where some kind of trauma preceded the disorder, such as a car accident causing brain trauma, strokes, aneurysms, oxygen deprivation of the brain, etc. The explanation often given is that since a disorder happens in the brain, and the brain is a physical organ, it is a disease. This doesn't actually prove the cause is a physical deformation, though. Instead, it sidesteps the scientific requirement of proof of specific causality. For example, if a person is tired, does this mean they have a brain disorder because the feeling occurs in the brain? Or might it have something to do with the fact that the person has a virus attacking their body, and their body is using up their energy to combat the virus? The specific causality here would be a virus, not a brain disease. In the same way, mental disorders require the same proof to be true diseases, yet are not held to that same requirement. Story 22. A pharmacist, Robert Courtney, was caught diluting prescriptions, most notably chemotherapy drugs. After 30 years and tons of faking insurance reports, at least 98,000 prescriptions were diluted over 4,200 patients. Insulin, AIDS medication, chemo. He diluted anything and everything. He got away with it because this was completely unheard of for pharmacists. Even with evidence, the FBI had a hard time believing it at first. This completely upended so many laws around pharmacies and medication and put a ton of checks in place. It would have been the trial of the century, with tons of legal issues over to what extent was this murder, since the victim count couldn't be determined. Who would have died due to cancer or illness anyways? Some people even got better. And he never ever kept records. He just did it compulsively. There was no method. Some chemo treatments were diluted only a bit. Some patients received bags of saline. But the extent of his damage couldn't be fully uncovered, and the situation didn't gain a ton of coverage outside of Kansas City, since the FBI and public attention were diverted a month later due to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. What's really strange, or maybe not really, is Courtney doesn't even know why he did it. He just put 25 pills in a bottle instead of 28, and told himself he would stop if anyone noticed. And for 30 years, he just went bigger and bigger. These were his neighbors and friends, people he knew by name and socialized with, played tennis with, held birthday parties for. The only person he treated that he didn't dilute for sure was his own mother. The Opportunist podcast did a 4-episode run on this if you want extreme depth on this. Story 23. Ronald Reagan, 40th president of the U.S. from 1980 to 1988, illegally sold arms to Iran during an arms embargo. The intent was to funnel money to the Contras in Nicaragua. Selling arms to Iran was illegal, and so was sending money to the Contras. This was partially justified by Reagan and his cohorts that they were trying to free American hostages in Lebanon. Many people were prosecuted for obstruction of justice, defrauding the U.S. government, conspiracy, withholding information, and making false statements. This would have brought down other presidents. Reagan somehow is still treated as a hero in the U.S. Other shady things Reagan was involved with, but this is the most thoroughly investigated. People act like it never happened. Story 24. Operation Northwoods. If you ever think a government won't attack its own people to further their agenda, this will change your mind. This one was stopped by JFK, but how many others have slipped through the cracks? As we see with Russia's false flags now, Just remember that every country has this tool at their disposal to sway public opinions. Sometimes all a gov has to do is sit on information about an imminent attack just a little too long. Breakdowns in communication and procedure, scheduled training around the expected attack, and they don't even have to use their own forces. Crap happens. Let's use it to our advantage. A government will sacrifice a few things, a few lives, if it gets them the desired outcome. The existence of operations like Northwoods and others throughout history is a testament to that. Story 25, I live in Sendai, Japan. In the months following the earthquake and tsunami of 3/11, there were reports up and down the coast of encounters with people that seemed lost and confused, often appearing at night in the middle of roads wandering alone. Mostly elderly people, but also reports of children as well. They usually held shared traits of talking about wanting to go home, trying to find their way home, as well as having wet clothes. Sure, they were soon designated as ghost stories, but it seemed like quite a few people, too many to brush off as coincidence, related very similar experiences of contact with these, let's call them lost souls. I've often wondered if they've found their way home yet, or if they still haunt the coastal roads at night and just aren't spoken about anymore. Story 26. At a local tribal casino around 2:30 a.m., my partner and I were walking to the car. We were the only people outside that I saw at least. Witnessed a car blowing up like an explosion. Flame, boom, about a city block length away from us. Not only that, but it was full of live ammunition that was also firing off from the vehicle. A security vehicle was approaching the scene when it suddenly started blaring the horn and accelerated into a nearby wall. Then the car horn starts blaring its horn from the heat, I would assume. We get ushered inside by a guard. The guards at the door are refusing to let anyone leave but won't tell them why. We are the only witness. As we're sitting and waiting to be able to go, we see around 20 civilians go into the bathroom and come out in bulletproof vests, guns, and the works. Then one of them starts interrogating these two drunk chicks sitting next to us. We find out they are the responsible party. They drunkenly exclaim that they thought if they traded shoes, they would get away with it. Nobody inside the casino knew what happened, not even most of the staff. The whole scene was cleaned up in a half hour, and everything went back to normal. It's a hard story to believe. I wouldn't believe it either. Sometimes I forget it happened until I come across the video we took of the burning vehicle.